Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH. Today we are looking at Zhulodok Void Gorger. So Zhulodok is a 6-mana colorless commander. It's a 7/4 legendary Eldrazi, and it says colorless spells you cast from your hand with mana value 7 or greater have Cascade, so they cascade twice. Now, while some people build Zhulodok as an Eldrazi tribal commander, and we do have some Eldrazi in the deck, I think that it's more of a colorless ramp deck, specifically because this ability, while it does obviously trigger with the big Eldrazi Titans, is more about just casting expensive colorless spells and not specifically Eldrazi. And there are a lot of Eldrazi that, while technically they do have the Devoid type, are not usable in this deck because of EDH's color identity rules. So an Eldrazi tribal deck is best left to a different card. So for now, let's just talk Zhulodok. So Zhulodok, we're going to want a lot of ramp because we have a 6-mana commander and we've got an ability that cares about casting other things that are very expensive. And we're a colorless deck. Colorless decks inherently are at a huge disadvantage in EDH. It's not just that you can't run various cards in colors, but a lot of the best cards in the format are those colors. So without blue, we have no access to counter spells or some of the best cards like Rhystic Study, Cyclonic Rift, Mystic Remora. Without green, we have no access to any of the green mana ramp cards or any of the protection effects like Veil of Summer. Without black or any of the other colors, we don't have access to the best tutors like Demonic, Enlightened, Mystical. So we've got to make up for this in colorless by having really strong payoffs or other combos. So right away, you may notice just on this first screen, we have a lot of big, expensive Eldrazi. So these cards are just good on their own as long as we can ramp to them, and also double Cascade with the Zhulodok. In general, I would consider the Cascade abilities not really combo and more of just an extra value add to anything we play here, because we're going to need to be playing a lot of cheaper cards, especially Mono Rocks, so our Cascades can hit random stuff. We might Cascade an Emrakul into a Kozilek, or we might Cascade it into just a Mono Rock. So that said, we've got Emrakul the Promised End, Emrakul the World Anew, Ulamog the Defiler, Kozilek the Great Distortion, Kozilek the Broken Reality, and Kozilek Butcher of Truth. All of these are just huge giant creatures that also have very useful abilities that steal our opponent's creatures, take their turns, exile their deck, draw cards, have Annihilator. Any card here we'd be happy to cast. We also have, for card draw, Mystic Forge, since we're obviously going to be playing a lot of both artifacts and colorless spells, and Sandstone Oracle. ETB, choose an opponent. If a player has more cards in hand than you, draw cards equal to the difference. So it's the same as basically the Kozilek ability, but on a cheaper creature. One ring, obviously. Then moving on to the combos. So there's going to be lots of things here that generate infinite mana. The most obvious ones are Forsaken Monument in combination with Basalt Monolith. This basically allows you to get more mana than you put in. In Basalt Monolith's case, you're going to generate one more than you pay. For Grim Monolith, we're going to need other combos. So Rings of Bright Hearth also combos with Basalt Monolith. We also have Voltaic Construct plus Toymaker. So Toymaker, discard a card and you turn a non-creature artifact into an artifact creature. So we're going to use that again on something like Basalt Monolith, and then we can Voltaic Construct to untap, but it's also just useful in terms of untapping things like Mana Vault, and then we can generate infinite mana that way. We also have Scorched Ruins plus Deserted Temple plus Rings of Bright Hearth, so in combination with all of those, we can Scorched Ruins taps for 4. We then activate Deserted Temple, trigger Rings of Bright Hearth. The Deserted Temple will untap both itself and Scorched Ruins. That in total with the Rings of Bright Hearth trigger will cost us 3, but the Scorched Ruins will produce 4, so we produce infinite mana that way. With infinite mana, we can obviously cast any of our big spells, or we can do Staff of Domination and draw our whole deck that way. We have Rise of the Eldrazi as just another huge payoff spell. Bunch of lands. We are running more lands than normal, and it's worth noting that specifically in colorless decks, only so many of the colorless specific lands are good before you start running out of them. But because you are not concerned about basics or color fixing for multiple colors, you can run a lot of lands that would otherwise normally not be very good, but you run them just because, hey, they have a utility ability, it's fine to run them. So to go through this, we've got obviously Ancient Tomb, Blast Zone, Buried Ruin gets an artifact back, Cavern of Souls obviously, Command Beacon, if Zhulodok dies, we want to be able to cast it not for 8+, Cryptic Caves, which we can sack to draw, Crystal Vein, just taps for colorless, or we can sack it to tap for double colorless. Darksteel Citadel and Treasure Vault are going to be relevant for artifact-related cards like Mox Opal. We've got Eldrazi Temple for double the mana for their Eldrazi. Emergent Zone if we want to cast stuff at instant speed. Fomori Vault, usually we're not going to use this, but at times it may be valuable to use it. may as well run this anyway, since we can just include colorless lands. Fountain Port, Gemstone Caverns, pretty much an auto-win in every deck anyway. Horizon of Progress, sack to draw. Inventor's Fair as a tutor. Mishra's Workshop for all of the artifacts that we're running. Obviously, Mishra's Workshop is extremely expensive, and if you don't want to proxy this and also don't want to shell out the $3,000+ it costs to buy Mishra's Workshop, that's fine. It's by no means necessary for the deck, so you can easily cut that. Planar Nexus is every non-basic type, which is going to be relevant as we get to the other lands. Sanctum of Ugin means we can transform our 7-drops into more 7-drops. Scavenger Grounds to eat graveyards. Scorched Ruins, as mentioned earlier. Shrine of Forsaken Gods for the expensive colorless spells. Talon Gates of Madara. Mycosynth Gardens. Thespian Stage. This is not a Dark Depths combo. It's specifically relevant for the same reason that Planar Nexus is going to be relevant, and that is specifically for the Urzatron lands. So we've got Urza Mine, Power Plant, and Tower. There's also Urza's Workshop. Tap for colorless. For each Urza land you control, activate only if you control 3 or more artifacts. Ugin's Labyrinth, Underdark Rift. Now, there's this one and there's Ominous Cemetery. I like Underdark Rift better because it can hit multiple different types of cards, rather than Ominous Cemetery, which only hits creatures. Urza's Cave, which can go fetch up other lands, Saga, and then War Room. And this is by no means all of the relevantly good colorless lands, but I do feel that this package here, these cards represent the best of them. Little bit of protection, specifically not of this world, unique to this deck. Counter target spell or ability that targets a permanent you control. It costs 7 less to cast if it targets a spell or ability that targets a creature you control with power 7 or greater. And it's specifically also an Eldrazi spell, so you can cast this off of that kind of stuff. Now, ramp. 29 ramp spells. We're going to need a lot because this deck revolves around turboing out ramp for our big spells, including our commander. So it's basically practically every single mono rock that we can get our hands on, even cards like Fractured Power Stone, which taps to roll the planar die, which is obviously completely irrelevant if you're not playing Plane Chase, but it's a 2-mana artifact that taps for a colorless, so we're running it. Basically, it doesn't matter what else the card does. Is it a 2-mana artifact that taps for at least 1? We're running it. We also have Metalworker, which can potentially go infinite with Staff of Domination. So if we have 3 artifacts in our hand, we can tap Metalworker, generate 6 mana, then the Staff of Domination pays 3 to untap the Metalworker, 1 to untap itself, we net 2. So we do need Metalworker plus Staff plus 3 artifacts in our hand, which is sometimes a tall order, but it is a way to go off. Or we can just use this as a regular old ramp spell. As long as we have at least 1 artifact in our hand, it's basically equivalent to Palladium Myrrh. And then the rest of this, Sonic Screwdriver untapping stuff is relevant to untap the One Ring. We also have Ugin the Ineffable, which reduces the cost of all of our colorless spells, which is every spell in our deck, and is relevant in various combos. So there are combos that involve casting things. You can reduce the cost there. It also just blows things up or just starts manifesting stuff. Primarily, you're going to use this as a cost reducer. Its secondary use is as a removal spell, and then its ancillary use is exiling to make 2/2s. And then we are running the untapping effects like Voltaic Key and Manifold Key, which can just be good to untap things like Monovault, but they can also potentially combo with Rings of Brighthearth. It depends, though. You really need very specific combinations of things to do that. And then cards like Gilded Lotus and Thran Dynamo and Monovault are part of the combo that is Toymaker plus Voltaic Construct. We have our colorless removal, which in this case is going to be cards like Cityscape Leveler, Meteor Golem, and Devourer of Destiny, all of which trigger the cascades off of Zhulodok. Then there's the 2 Ulamogs that target things. And Desecrate Reality. For each opponent, exile up to 1 target permanent the player controls with an even mana value, but Adamant, if at least 3 colorless mana was spent to cast this spell, return a permanent card with an odd mana value from your graveyard to the battlefield. A little bit of stacks in Cursed Totem and Torpor Orb. Cursed Totem does stop some of our stuff from working, specifically Metalworker and Voltaic Construct, so we can't just play this for free, but it's usually going to be more detrimental for our opponents, shutting off all of their mana dorks, than it is detrimental for us. And Torpor Orb, most of our creatures trigger from casting. There are some that don't, like Meteor Golem, but most are cast triggers. Then we've got our Sweepers, Ugin, Portal to Phyrexia, All is Dust. And then Tutors, aside from the ones we already mentioned, there is Expedition Map and Moonsilver Key, which goes and grabs an artifact with a mana ability or basic land. In this case, we're usually using this to grab Basalt Monolith for combos. I will also note that among the land base, there is not a single Wastes. Wastes is not too relevant, but there are some cases where it is. So first of all, if you get Blood Mooned, it is the only land that will still be able to tap for Colorless, although that usually isn't relevant because you have a million Mana Rocks that also tap for Colorless. It's also relevant in the specific case that your opponent is running basic land searching effects, things like Assassin's Trophy or Path to Exile. Now, usually those cards aren't too popular, but sometimes they're run, so if you're in a play group that has those types of cards, you'll obviously want to run at least one waste. Note, Beseiju does not allow you to grab wastes. And then finally, there's some cards that didn't neatly fit into any specific category, so Liberator allows us to cast all of our spells at flash speed, and Oblivion Sower is just a big old Eldrazi that when you cast a spell, target opponent exiles the top 4 of their library, then you may put any number of land cards that player owns from exile onto the battlefield under your control. If you've got an infinite bounce effect, you can bounce this and replay it if with infinite mana over and over to deck your opponent. I don't think that's the case in this deck. You can also just use it as a ramp spell that's also an Eldrazi, although it's a little awkward with being 6 mana, so it doesn't trigger the cascade off of Zhulodok. This is probably the card that if you were looking to cut cards from the deck, this would be the first cut. And then finally, there's Echoes of Eternity, a 6 mana Kindred Enchantment Eldrazi. So because it's an Eldrazi, you can tap Eldrazi Temple for this. If a triggered ability of a colorless spell you control or another colorless permanent you control triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. Whenever you cast a colorless spell, copy it, and you choose new targets for the copy. So obviously this works great with tons of our cards, specifically all the Eldrazi Titans with their cast triggers. This is also potentially a combo piece. Now, it's probably not a combo piece in this version of the deck, but there are ways that this combos with stuff. I won't highlight them here because, again, this list doesn't have them. If you're curious, go to Commander Spellbook, put in Echoes of Eternity, and you can see all the combos with this. It does copy triggered abilities, so it can copy things like Rings of Brighthearth, which might be relevant, but if you're triggering Rings of Brighthearth in the first place, you probably could combo without this. But with all that said, that is going to be Zhulodok Void Gorger for EDH.